The first light of September 15, 1944, revealed a horizon already trembling under the weight of war. Off the shores of Peleliu, a small coral island in the Palau chain, the silhouettes of American battleships loomed like black monoliths. Then the silence of the ocean was torn apart. Naval guns erupted, vomiting fire and thunder that rolled across the sea in endless waves. The sky itself seemed to crack open, as if the gods of destruction had chosen this day to unleash their fury. On the decks of the fleet, the shock of each broadside rattled through steel and bone alike. Communication was reduced to shouts, yet even the loudest voices were swallowed by the storm. Columns of smoke climbed into the morning air, mixing with the salt of the sea and the acrid sting of cordite, until the very atmosphere became unbreathable. Each detonation threw flames skyward, painting the beaches of Peleliu in a violent, strobing light. In the landing craft, Marines of the 1st Division waited. They had been promised that the bombardment would scour the island clean, that the enemy would be crushed before their boots touched sand. But as they huddled in the diesel-stained air, gripping rifles slick with sweat, their eyes betrayed something deeper, an unspoken knowledge that no amount of fire could erase what awaited them beyond the reef. The island, shrouded in smoke, lay ahead like a grave unsealed. Peleliu was small, barely 6 miles long, yet it stood as a gateway to the Philippines, and thus to the heart of the war in the Pacific. On this morning, it was not a mere speck of coral. It was a fortress, a test, and for many a final destination. By 1944, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield of Japanese expansion, but a theater of American advance. The tide had turned. Island by island, reef by reef, the United States carved a bloody path across the ocean. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam. The names had already been etched into the ledger of sacrifice, and yet the vastness of the Pacific still loomed, forcing American strategists to choose their next move carefully, for each step meant thousands of lives. At the center of the debate stood 2 titans, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and General Douglas MacArthur, the imperious soldier who had sworn to return to the Philippines. Their visions clashed like tectonic plates. Nimitz, deliberate and methodical, advocated a sharp thrust northward, striking Okinawa and Formosa, bypassing the Philippines altogether. For him, Peleliu and its neighboring islands were but stepping stones toward the home islands themselves. MacArthur saw differently. His eyes were fixed on the Philippines, not just as a military objective, but as a stage for his personal vow, a promise to liberate a people abandoned in the opening chapters of the war. To bypass them was, in his view, to abandon honor. He argued that without the Philippines secured, any push toward Japan would leave the American flank exposed to Japanese air power. The argument reached the highest level. In July 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt traveled to Hawaii to listen to his commanders in person. Both men laid out their strategies. Both invoked the necessity of speed, sacrifice, and national destiny. In the end, Roosevelt sided with MacArthur. The Philippines would be taken no matter the cost. That decision, made in the calm of a conference room far from the roar of artillery, sealed the fate of Peleliu. For if the Philippines were to be invaded, Palau had to be neutralized. Its airfields, mere streaks of coral, suddenly carried the weight of strategy. To leave them in Japanese hands would be to risk the annihilation of entire convoys and divisions en route to Leyte. Thus, an island only 6 miles long, shaped like a claw, became a target of monumental significance. It was marked for invasion not because it was vast or rich, but because it lay in the way. And so the machinery of war turned its eyes to Peleliu, an island too small for the weight of history now thrust upon it. While American commanders debated their next step, on Peleliu the Japanese prepared for a battle that would defy every expectation. In the early years of the Pacific War, their strategy had been reckless and almost ritualistic. Human wave attacks, desperate banzai charges, officers wielding swords against machine guns. It had been bravery bordering on futility, and it had cost them entire regiments. By 1944, the Japanese High Command knew such tactics no longer guaranteed anything but slaughter. A new doctrine emerged, one that reflected grim acceptance rather than blind zeal. It was called fukaku, defense in depth. Instead of contesting every inch of shoreline, Japanese troops would withdraw into the interior, into strongholds carved from coral and stone. The goal was no longer to throw the invaders back into the sea, but to bleed them white, to make every yard cost lives, to turn each advance into a grinding attrition. Peleliu became the testing ground for this new way of war. General Sadai Inoue, commander of the Palau district group, surveyed the archipelago and concluded that Peleliu would bear the brunt of the American assault. He placed his trust in Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, a man known for tactical brilliance and ruthless resolve. To him was given nearly 10,000 defenders, a mix of hardened infantry, naval gunners, and conscripted Korean laborers. The island itself seemed shaped for resistance. At its southern end stretched low flatlands and coconut groves, where one expendable battalion would be stationed to harass the landings. But the true defense lay deeper inland. Running through Peleliu's spine were the Umabrogol Mountains, a chain of jagged ridges and ravines. They were not high, their peaks barely rising 300 to 500 feet, but they were cruel, sharp coral teeth covered in jungle. Here, Nakagawa envisioned his fortress. Natural caves were widened into vast chambers capable of sheltering hundreds. Steel doors were fitted to firing slits, embrasures camouflaged beneath foliage, artillery concealed until the exact moment of ambush. Machine guns peered through cracks invisible to the naked eye, while mortars were in place to cover every valley. Engineers blasted tunnels that connected positions underground, allowing troops to vanish into the earth and reappear elsewhere like phantoms. The defenses were not just military installations, they were tombs in waiting. Nakagawa and his officers knew that no reinforcement would come, no relief fleet would appear. Peleliu was part of the so-called absolute defense zone, the last shield before the home islands themselves. Their task was not victory but delay at any price, in blood and in time. By the late summer of 1944, Peleliu had become a hidden citadel. From the air it appeared lush and unremarkable, a green jewel set in turquoise seas. But beneath that canopy of palms and jungle lay a labyrinth of stone, fire, and steel. The stage was set. The Americans believed their bombardment would level the island in days. The Japanese prepared to prove them wrong, prepared to transform Peleliu into a crucible where thousands would enter and few would emerge unchanged. On the morning of September 15, 1944, the first assault waves of the 1st Marine Division edged toward the reef of Peleliu. The men sat shoulder to shoulder in their Amtraks, the steel hulls rattling as the diesel engines growled. They had been told the naval bombardment had shattered every defense, that the Japanese would be too broken to resist. Yet even as the landing craft advanced, geysers of water erupted nearby, columns thrown skyward by hidden artillery. The illusion of an easy landing dissolved before their eyes. The Marines had eaten steak and eggs at dawn, a tradition meant to fortify body and spirit. Now that heavy meal soured in their stomachs as the air filled with the choking blend of cordite and diesel. Many painted their faces with streaks of jungle camouflage, but paint could not mask the fear etched into their expressions. Some clenched their rifles so tightly their knuckles turned white. Others whispered fragments of prayer, knowing that minutes separated them from fire and death. Ahead the beaches writhed under smoke and flame. Naval guns had churned the sand into craters, toppling palm trees like matchsticks. Yet the defenders had not been destroyed. Colonel Nakagawa had ordered silence during the bombardment, allowing the Americans to believe the artillery was gone. Now, as the first Amtraks neared shore, the Japanese opened fire with a fury that ripped through steel and flesh alike. Shells from 47mm guns and streams of 20mm machine gun fire slashed into the landing craft. In less than an hour, more than half of the tracked vehicles were shattered or burning, their wrecks scattered across the shallows. Marines abandoned wrecked transports, plunging into water waist-deep, rifles held overhead, packs dragging them down as bullets whipped the surf. Some never reached shore, their bodies sinking silently beneath the reef. On the northern flank, the 1st Marine Regiment, led by Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, staggered forward under punishing fire. Puller's own vehicle was struck, nearly killing him, and his communications team was wiped out in an instant. In the center, the 5th Marines surged toward the airfield, their objective, but the ground was cut by trenches and hidden bunkers that spat fire from every angle. To the south, the 7th Marines faced a maze of pillboxes, each demanding grenades, satchel charges, or flamethrowers before surrendering. The beach itself became a charnel ground. Combat artist Tom Lee, who landed with the first waves, recalled seeing a Marine collapse beside him, half of his face obliterated, the white sand turning red beneath him. Eugene Sledge, a young Marine who would later record his memories in haunting detail, remembered shells slapping the sand and fragments striking water inches from his head. For those who survived the reef crossing, the beach offered no safety, only more fire. The objective had been to secure Peleliu in 5 days. By the end of the first, it was clear that such promises were illusions. The Marines were ashore, but at a cost that no optimism could disguise. Peleliu had revealed itself not as a quick stepping stone, but as a crucible of fire, where each yard would be bought with blood. The landing was only the beginning. The heart of Peleliu was not its beaches or its airfield. It was the Umurbrogel Ridge, a twisted chain of coral hills, ravines, and knife-edged ridges that the Marines would rename Bloody Nose Ridge. What appeared from the air as gentle rises cloaked in green was on the ground a labyrinth of jagged rock and concealed fortifications. For the men who entered, the Umurbrogel became a place of torment, a furnace that consumed bodies and minds alike. By the second day ashore, the Marines realized they were trapped in a nightmare terrain. The ridges towered only a few hundred feet, yet their steep walls forced soldiers into narrow channels where machine guns and mortars rained. Each draw was a killing ground, each ravine a funnel of fire. The Japanese had blasted caves into the coral, linking them with tunnels so that defenders seemed to vanish into the earth, only to reappear behind the attackers. Flamethrowers and grenades cleared one opening, only for fire to erupt from another slit a few yards away. The heat was merciless. Temperatures climbed above 100 degrees and in the shade soared higher still. The coral reflected the sun until every breath felt like inhaling flame. Canteens emptied quickly, but the trek to refill them across exposed ground often meant death. Men collapsed from heat prostration. Their lips cracked, their tongues swollen, their skin blistered. Exhaustion mixed with terror until soldiers moved as if in a trance, advancing because to remain still meant annihilation. Casualties mounted. Entire rifle companies dwindled to a fraction of their strength. Engineers, cooks, and clerks were pressed into the line, rifles shoved into their hands because every able body was needed. Even African-American Marines of the ammunition and depot companies, relegated by segregation to support roles, volunteered to carry supplies and evacuate the wounded under fire. On Peleliu, survival erased boundaries. Anyone who could fight, fought. The Japanese exploited the terrain with ruthless precision. They did not waste themselves in reckless charges. Instead, they clung to their caverns, striking with disciplined bursts, then disappearing into tunnels. At night, they crept through the darkness, infiltrating lines, tossing grenades into foxholes, bayoneting men as they slept. Every sound in the blackness could mean death, every shadow a phantom ready to kill. Sleep became shallow, broken by screams of men set ablaze or torn apart by sudden shellfire. Marine veteran Eugene Sledge would later write that in this place he resigned from the human race. For many, compassion and restraint dissolved. Surrounded by corpses bloating under the sun, the stench of decay filling every breath, soldiers grew numb. Some admitted they fired at anything that moved, friend or foe, their humanity buried under the relentless slaughter. The Umurbrogel stripped men to their rawest core, where survival alone mattered. To assault a single ridge could take days, sometimes weeks. Flamethrowers belched liquid fire into caves, the screams of the dying echoing out before silence fell. Bulldozers pushed rubble to seal entrances, entombing defenders alive. Yet still the Japanese fought on, retreating deeper into the honeycomb, forcing the Americans to bleed for every yard. Progress was measured not in miles, but in feet, each one costing dearly. For the Marines who staggered through its jagged corridors, the Umabrogel was not a battlefield but a vision of hell. Here, under a sky that seared flesh and amid rocks that tore bone, men discovered the limits of endurance. Bloody Nose Ridge would become a name etched into memory, not for its geography, but for the blood spilled to take it, a place where valor and despair walked hand in hand, and where the very soul of man seemed to wither in the heat and smoke of endless war. In the chaos of Peleliu, certain battles stood out as symbols of endurance and sacrifice. They were not sweeping maneuvers across vast territories, but desperate struggles for a single ridge, a single bunker, or a blockhouse hidden in the coral. These moments revealed the essence of the campaign, progress measured in yards, victory purchased with flesh. One such ordeal was the fight for a coral outcrop the Marines called the Point. Rising some 30 feet above the shoreline, it was riddled with tunnels and concealed machine gun nests. From this position, Japanese fire raked the beaches and pinned down entire companies. Frontal assaults shattered against its defenses, leaving the sand littered with bodies. The task of taking it fell to Captain George Hunt and his Company K of the 1st Marines. Moving with caution and desperation, Hunt's men used fire and smoke to cover their advance. Grenades and satchel charges were hurled into the black mouths of pillboxes, flamethrowers seared chambers where defenders clung to their weapons even as flames consumed them. Finally, a lucky rifle grenade ricocheted into the main blockhouse, striking stored ammunition. The explosion tore through the fortification, sending fire and debris into the sky. The point was theirs, but the cost was staggering. Out of more than 200 men, fewer than 80 remained alive when the position was finally secured. Elsewhere, the ordeal of Captain Everett Pope and his Company B echoed the same grim pattern. Ordered to seize Hill 100, Pope led fewer than 100 men up the slope under withering fire. When they reached the crest, they discovered the maps were wrong. The hill was not isolated, but part of a larger ridge connected to higher ground still in enemy hands. Surrounded, short of ammunition, Pope and his men dug in. All night the Japanese counterattacked, rushing from ravines and hurling grenades into the Marine perimeter. In the dark, combat turned primitive. Bayonets flashed, fists struck bone, rifle butts smashed skulls. When ammunition ran low, Marines hurled rocks, hoping the enemy would mistake them for grenades. Hours stretched into eternity, the cries of the wounded mingling with the sharp crack of gunfire. By dawn, only 9 survivors stumbled back to American lines. For his stand, Pope would later be awarded the Medal of Honor, but the honor did not erase the memory of the men left behind on the slopes. These episodes were not anomalies, they were the rhythm of Peleliu. Each ridge demanded its tribute in blood, each bunker resisted until destroyed utterly. Heroism was constant, but so was despair. The Marines pressed forward not out of confidence in victory, but because stopping meant being overrun. Breaking points came daily, yet somehow, through exhaustion and terror, the line held. Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, carried into Peleliu an optimism that bordered on delusion. Before the landings, he had assured his men that the island would be secured in 5 days. Even as casualties soared into the thousands and progress slowed to a crawl, he clung to this vision. To him, the ferocity of the Japanese defense was merely a temporary obstacle. He ordered his regiments to maintain momentum, as if repetition of the phrase might conjure victory from ruin. Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller and his 1st Marines were the ones paying the price for this stubbornness. Within the first 3 days, his regiment lost more than 1,000 men. Entire companies were reduced to fragments, and every survivor bore the hollow look of a man walking a thin line between endurance and collapse. Yet Rupertus refused to request reinforcements. Only a few miles away, the United States Army's 81st Infantry Division had already seized nearby Angkor Island with comparatively lighter losses. They stood ready to support the Marines, to pour fresh troops into Peleliu's bleeding ridges. But Rupertus rejected their assistance. Pride and rivalry between services blinded him. The battle for Peleliu, he insisted, was to be a Marine Corps fight alone. It was Major General Roy Geiger, commander of the 3rd Amphibious Corps, who finally broke the impasse. After inspecting the shattered remnants of Pulla's regiment, he saw the truth with his own eyes. The 1st Marines were no longer a fighting unit, but a collection of exhausted survivors clinging to survival. Geiger demanded that the army enter the battle, despite Rupertus's resistance. Heated arguments followed, but Geiger's authority prevailed. By late September, the 81st Division began landing reinforcements on Peleliu's western beaches. The army would carry the burden forward, but the scars left on the Marines could not be undone. Pride had prolonged their suffering, and rivalry had cost lives measured not in dozens but in hundreds. In Peleliu, the battlefield did not just reveal the cruelty of the enemy, it exposed the frailty of command, the arrogance that could bleed a regiment nearly to death. By the final weeks of September, the Japanese garrison was confined to the jagged fortress of the Umurbrogol. What had once been an entire division of nearly 10,000 men had been reduced to scattered groups, clinging to caves and tunnels. Yet their will did not falter. For them, Peleliu was no longer a battlefield to win, but a grave to die in. The Americans tightened the noose. The 5th and 7th Marine regiments, battered and thinned, were finally withdrawn. In their place came the fresh soldiers of the 81st Infantry Division. With artillery, mortars, and close air support from Marine corsairs roaring overhead, the army took up the slow, merciless work of reducing the Japanese strongholds. Flamethrowers became weapons of choice, spewing rivers of fire into blackened cave mouths. Napalm canisters exploded with a roar, sending rolling waves of flame into the labyrinth. Bulldozers followed, pushing coral and earth to seal the entrances, trapping defenders inside their own fortifications. From above, aircraft dropped bombs so close to the American lines that fragments peppered their own airfields. Still, the Japanese fought on. At night, they crept from hidden exits, striking at sentries, tossing grenades into foxholes, vanishing once more into the earth. By day, they answered bombardment with sniper fire and sudden ambushes. Each cave was a citadel, each ridge a separate siege. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the commander of Peleliu's defense, knew the battle was lost. Yet bound by duty and the code of Bushido, he refused surrender. When his position could no longer hold, he ordered his regimental colors burned. Then, like countless officers before him, he took his own life. His men continued the fight without him, scattered groups resisting until annihilation. By late November, organized resistance ceased. Out of more than 10,000 defenders, barely 200 prisoners were taken alive, most of them Korean laborers pressed into service. For the Americans, the island was finally theirs. But the victory came too late, at too high a cost for too little gain. Peleliu was secure, but it was a ruin of ash, coral, and corpses. When the guns finally fell silent, Peleliu lay in ruins. The island had been transformed from a green jewel of the Pacific into a blasted wasteland of craters, wrecks, and scorched coral. For the Americans, victory came at a price that seemed to mock the promise of a swift operation. The 1st Marine Division, once proud and strong, had been gutted. Thousands of men were dead or maimed, and entire companies existed now only as names etched on casualty lists. The Japanese garrison had been annihilated. Out of more than 10,000 defenders, scarcely 200 survived as prisoners, most of them not soldiers at all, but Korean laborers forced to dig and haul for the empire. Colonel Nakagawa and nearly all his officers lay dead by their own hands, their bodies sealed in the same earthworks where they had fought with such ferocity. And yet, in the larger tide of war, the capture of Peleliu brought little reward. Within weeks, the invasion of the Philippines was underway. The feared Japanese threat from the Palau chain never materialized. Historians would later question whether the battle had been necessary at all, or whether Peleliu was sacrificed on the altar of flawed intelligence and pride. The island itself was not finished with war. In April of 1947, nearly 2 years after Japan's surrender, a group of 26 survivors emerged from the jungle and caves. Led by Lieutenant Tadamichi Yamaguchi, they handed over their weapons and a single samurai sword in final capitulation. For them, the war had never truly ended until that moment. Thus Peleliu passed into memory, not as a decisive turning point, but as a symbol of the cruelty of attrition, of lives spent on barren ridges and in burning caves. It stood as a reminder that in war, victory can be indistinguishable from loss, and that even triumph may echo hollow across the graves it leaves behind.